This must be written in haste, for I've little time before more enemies pile into this hellish land to look for missing soldiers. This began the 26th of September, 1918, the Meuse Argonne offensive. I've no idea what the current date is. It's been too many nights and too much death. The situation began to deteriorate rapidly when the numbers and weaponry of the offensive became clear. Behemoth-armored devils breathing fire into our direction. My brothers turned into walking skeletons with the burns of hellfire upon their skin from the gas. The night fell early due to the heavy rains and fog, as if God were crying onto the battlefield while exhaling smoke from a newly rolled cigarette. The medicinal tent, full of fresh blood and fresh dead, as well as old blood and old dead. We were too afraid to give a proper burial above the trenches. I knelt down to an officer who could barely speak after the most recent gas attack to see if I could be of any aid. He harshly mumbled under his breath, "Watchman." I knelt closer as he exhumed the remaining breath and asked him to repeat, my ear gently resting against his lips as I waited for a reply.
"Get the fuck out of here, you aren't a fucking medic."
They began to wrap his body and take it where I assumed they took the rest of the bodies, to the end of the trench. "That's how we'll all end up if we don't cut our losses and leave this god-forsaken mud," a man announced behind me. Those tending to the officer paid no mind. "What's your deal? You just like playing with the dead?" the soldier asked. "Just looking into the future, according to your logic." I was gifted a smirk before he left my presence and disappeared into the night. As I walked through the trench and saw all of the men going through their daily routine, I began to feel a dissociation with reality. No longer was I in battle. No longer was I in war. Worse than that. It was a purgatory painted to be a muddy trench where I cannot live and cannot die. Before I was able to realize what was even going on, I ran into a wall of the trench. I almost fell completely into the mud, but caught myself with the butt of my rifle. I could barely see, but I knew I was a long ways from the rest of the men. I heard no chatter, no moans of the injured. I couldn't think of a good reason to march back toward certain death, so I turned left and went to where the trench would lead. I walked and walked until a dreaded stench begot my attention. Something that caused a scowl upon my face. I looked into the blackness of the night and didn't much mind the rain at this point as I began to see a large pile of an even darker blackness. As I stepped closer, the mud became more dense, and the more strength I had to use to pull myself up for one more step. I could almost reach the pile of the ebony until I heard it. My eyes opened, but I couldn't see. I felt a great weight of the upper half of my body, and I could barely breathe. As I tried to scream, the weight became lighter and lighter. A small glimmer of light shone into my eye. Someone grabbed my hand and pulled me with great force, and pulled me out of the dirt and rubble.
"Let's give it to them, then."
I was back amongst the soldiers and wounded that I had wandered away from. And now we were being attacked and losing ground quick. No sooner than I had raised my head above the trench, I saw the flashing of enemy muzzles. The chanting and heroic screaming of my brothers became lighter and lighter, while boots in the mud became increasingly louder. An apparition began to approach me at a horrific speed. I drew my rifle, but it was too late. I was pushed back down into the floor of the trench with the body on top of me.
"Kill him! Kill him!"
I screamed. He began to rise off of me and pulled me to my feet.
"No! Retreat! Retreat now or perish!"
He screamed into my face. He immediately dashed into the rain and fog as I watched him unnaturally disappear. I felt a hand on my shoulder as I turned quickly to another officer. "How the hell with his kind, yeah? We can win this war, just you and I." His voice dimmed as he climbed the trench towards rushing boots. As I grabbed the ladder, I heard what sounded like my brothers screaming into battle. Only the voices were heading my direction. Sharp sounds of ammunition whizzing and ricocheting by my head. After I collapsed into the mud, I realized I'm alone and awaiting death. My only route to survival was to throw my rifle into the mud and my hands into the air. Within moments, foreign language and foreign hands began pulling at me. As they brought me to my feet, some began to bash me. They were pulled away quickly. They tied my hands behind my back and began shoving me out of the trench. I used my face and my knees to crawl through the mud before a hefty man pulled me up as if I were his own rifle. He looked into my eyes and chuckled, then gently smacked my face as if to say, "Nice try." He wiped the mud from his hand and onto my uniform, and walked away. When he disappeared from my sight, I saw a new terror. Thousands, and yes, I do mean thousands, of my brothers clung together and being marched along into the forest, made to step on and over their own brothers and leaders, prisoners of war. And I was one of them. The side of a rifle jolted into my back, and I was hurried along and tied to a group of 10 brothers. 5 Americans, armed to the teeth, surrounded us and gave us an order to march. I was the very last in line. We marched and marched for what seemed to be eternity, the scenery never changing. Giant puddles of mud and dead trees occupy the stricken land. No type of life was allowed to thrive. The only sound was mud being sloshed by boots and the rattle of the American gear the soldiers were carrying. They began to stir about with one another and began to chuckle. A deep sense of dread came over me as we were made to stop in the middle of nothing. Starting from the front of the line, one by one, we were each offered a cigarette, by whom I assume was their commander. When the opportunity arose, I respectfully declined the cigarettes. First, they take me prisoner, and now they try to subject me to their American tobacco. The gall. 5 of my brothers accepted their offer and were cut from the rope and their hands freed. The Americans even lit the cigarette for them. I saw a brother take his first draw and exhale blue American smoke. I watched the smoke wither away as it passed me. My head snapped toward my brothers quick enough to see them fall to the ground. Every single one that took a cigarette was now dead. The Americans found great amusement in wasting their tobacco. My brothers and I simultaneously began to run in the opposite direction and simultaneously fell into the cold, wet mud. As we all struggled to stand, the American soldiers ran towards us and knocked us down with their rifles pointed at our heads. They were all screaming while we waited for the final shots to be fired. Then something hit the ground by my feet with a thud. I fell into the fetal position, waiting for an explosion, thinking it was a grenade. But alas, nothing. No explosion. Someone then grabbed me by the back of my uniform and pulled me up like I was their rifle for the second time that night. The Americans were pointing at the ground. Shovels. 5 shovels at our feet. My brothers and I looked at each other with dread in our eyes. One of the Americans then yelled, "Hey!" Our attention snapped to him as he mimicked the motion of us using the shovel. "Dig!" He shouted as if we were hard of hearing, as if we were listening to our own commanding officers. We grabbed the shovels and began to dig where we stood. The war-torn wilderness made the ground somewhat easy to dig unless you ran into shrapnel. The longer we dug this mass grave, the more surreal everything began to feel, as if I could just stop and walk away freely because no man in this world is this evil. Tears began to fall from my eyes, not out of sadness but for the lack of blinking. My eyes had not closed once while we were digging. I was in such a trance that I didn't hear the chatter from the Americans nor the shovels piercing the mud and rock in my immediate vicinity. As I came to, I looked up toward the American. Immediately, their bastard eyes set upon me. I looked back down and continued to dig. The silence engulfed us all until the snapping of a twig commanded all of our attention. The sound only gained a moment of my attention before I began to dig further. The Americans, though, they were intrigued. They stared and spoke into the direction of the sound. They spoke with vigor and ignorant assurance. A low and distant neighing and hooves of a horse could be heard, and the Americans became quiet. I finally looked to my brothers by my side and noticed they resembled my actions, cold and afraid stares. Then came an eerie calm and quiet. The air died in silence, and the tree leaves along with the Americans settled. A voice sounding from the blackness of the forest whispered toward, "Come." 2 of the 5 Americans walked and disappeared into the night where the voice emanated from. We all look into the pitch black until we hear a rifle fire. I couldn't possibly count how many shots were fired in what seemed like an eternity. Then suddenly, they stopped. An American called out to his fellow soldiers to no answer. Another dead silence until a blue moon reflected off of a fiery red coat of this giant beast of a horse, along with the horse rider's sword glinting in the light as it pointed toward the sky. With one quick charge and fatal swing, the first of the last 3 Americans lost his head. My brothers and I stood in disbelief as the head rolled on to the ground. The head didn't even resemble anything human, but as if someone had made a wax sculpture of it and then threw it into the mud. The 2 Americans ran towards us, but before they could reach us, in a simultaneous fashion they were split from the waist by the horseman's sword. The horse turned opposite of us and ran a few yards away before turning back at us, pawing the ground. I looked at the severed waist of the American and began to accept my fate. With a staunch neigh, the horseman began his charge. My eyes closed as he galloped closer and closer. I hear the ripping of flesh and life leaving bodies. Screams of terror that would send shivers down the devil's spine. And then, quiet. I dared not to open my eyes and witness the treachery at my feet. I heard hooves approach me slowly. I felt the coldest iron I have ever felt upon my chin. I opened my eyes as the horseman pulls my head up towards him with the edge of his blade. And he is faceless, almost shapeless. The horseman raises his sword, and then I wake up, alone, surrounded by dead foreigners and dead brothers, in a cold, foggy forest, with a half attempt of a dug-in mass grave, with an icy cold blade by my side, and in the distance, a fiery red horse ready to be mounted.